friends. I'm in a different part of the sewing room to usual because I felt like it. There are a lot of new faces in the channel, which is amazing. I'm super glad everyone decided to stick around, whether that was for sewing related content post-COVID or me being unreasonably salty about a hobby I allegedly like. Now obviously I don't want to set unreasonable expectations for the channel or anything, but look at me getting another video out quickly so you all don't just run away. Mini update, if this is the first or second video you're seeing, this is part of a series in which I chart my slow descent into insanity due to a complete and total lack of human content. It's been going for several months now and it's been really quite productive. I did think long and hard about how to balance the two main sources of new followers that I've had recently, and I decided that the best thing to do was to make a sewing video where I also talk about Larp. This is going to go one of two ways. This is the journey of me working on some 18th century projects that had been previously started and abandoned approximately 6 years ago. They also led me down a weird and interesting rabbit hole, which caused me to have some hashtag deep thoughts. So without further ado, here is what we can learn about LARPing from Marie Antoinette. For starters, some sewing. I had these 2 pieces of synthetic taffeta hanging around that I had meant to turn into a petticoat many years ago, and decided it would be better to actually use them than just throw them away. I also haven't used my 18th century kit in approximately 5 years, and these pocket hoops even longer, which is possibly why they look so ratty and awful. More on that later. What I'm doing here is trying to level the hem of the petticoat. Because the 18th century silhouette is so wide, what you're actually doing is having a hem that's cut on the straight grain and then adjusting the difference in length at the top. This gave me far more trouble than it had any right to. There will now be a long series of clips in which I mess around with the pleats, trying to get the waistline to sit properly so it is shorter in the middle and longer at the sides to fit over the pocket hoops. Okay, let's talk about Marie Antoinette. Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna was born on the 2nd of November 1755. In 1770, she married the Dauphin of France, later to become Louis XVI, and reigned as Queen of France until this little thing called the French Revolution happened. Over her reign between 1774 and 1792, she became increasingly unpopular with the French public. Her lavish spending, luxurious and improbable lifestyle, and numerous scandals all contributed to her bad reputation. By the time she was accused of high treason, tried and executed by the Revolutionary Tribunal in 1793, the popular image of Marie Antoinette was someone who favoured luxury and leisure over her royal duties, was frivolous, unintelligent, unfaithful, possessing of a depraved morality, and, most relevant to us, completely cut off from the reality of the society she lived in. A friend of mine once described Marie Antoinette as the first LARPer. It's a massive oversimplification, but everyone knows the stories of her dressing up as a shepherdess and pretending at being a farmer, all while surrounded by all the riches and luxury that France could offer her. I'll be honest, I thought this video was going to turn into some kind of searing monologue about how privileged LARPers putting on poor people costumes for a weekend doesn't mean that they understand or indeed excuses their privilege related to their economic security. But it took me about 20 seconds of research to realise that actually the story here was completely different. For some reason, I think I maybe registered Janet Arnold. I thought that the extra length on the petticoat needed to be folded inside, so I spent quite a long time trying to get the petticoat to do that and also lie flat-ish against my waist. It didn't work. In summary, it just didn't work. No amount of pinning or basting or fabric manipulation was going to make this horrible synthetic taffeta behaving quite the way that I thought it should, and it later turned out I was barking up the wrong tree entirely anyway. Eventually, unable to get things to work in the way that I thought that they should, I decided to look it up in an actual book and undid literally everything that I already done. Turns out you can just cut cut off the difference. That is a thing that you can do. You can just chop it off and everything lies much more smoothly. Funny that. There then followed a long period of pleating and repleating, as it turned out that I cannot math. I managed to pleat each side of the petticoat down to my waist measurement, which is a problem because each side of the petticoat should be half of my waist measurement. So here you will watch me spending a great deal of time pleating my petticoat down, then undoing it all and repleating it to a completely different measurement. In the grounds of the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's palace within Versailles, is the Hameau de la Reine. Please excuse my French accent. This translates as the Queen's Hamlet. It's an exquisite model farm. A handful of buildings arranged around a lake, all made to look like quaint, rural French cottages. On the Wikipedia page for the hamlet, you can find the following passage. The hamlet was part of Marie Antoinette's estate, and she enjoyed dressing as a young shepherdess or milkmaid and acting like a peasant, while surrounded by the comforts of a royal lifestyle. The unintentional mockery of the economically depressed French peasants helped build the resentment towards the monarchy among the French people that eventually led to the French Revolution. It goes on, Marie Antoinette would stroll around her perfect world in simple peasant's garb with her children, part of an idealised nature. Her closest friends joined her in the ornamental village, where they also enjoyed pretending to live a simple life. The extravagance and subtle mockery of peasant life did not help Marie Antoinette's already suffering image. While this Wikipedia page does redeem itself somewhat in my eyes by including the sentence, "A misogynistic, nationalistic and class-driven polemic swirled around the hamlet," which I was later to find out is more true than I think they realise, it would be really easy to take this page at its word and accept that that was what was happening. Marie Antoinette had a pretend farm where she played at being a poor person. Except it isn't. The Wikipedia page links itself to the official Versailles site and the page for the Queen's Hamlet on that site in English. You only have to get about halfway down the first paragraph before you find this information. Contrary to the deeply entrenched public image of Marie Antoinette, the Queen and her entourage did not, in quotes, play at being farmers. The Queen actually used the hamlet as a place for relaxing walks or to host small gatherings. The fact that the hamlet was also a functioning farm, a point upon which the Queen insisted, meant that it served an educational role for the royal children. I then found the jacket, which again I had started 6 years ago. Let's just say it went wrong. I had very limited fabric. For some reason decided that I wanted a pattern layer which has the pleats in the back instead of doing a fitted style, which would have been much easier. The sleeves were much too small for the sleeve holes, and I just abandoned it and shoved it in a bag and never looked at it again. So the first thing I did was take off my failed attempt at putting a sleeve in, measure out the armhole versus the top curve of the sleeve, and then started figuring out how much bigger I would need to make the sleeves. I'm going to do this by piecing. Basically, I'm going to cut up these sleeves as they are and insert extra bits of fabric until they end up the size I want them. You will see as I work on this, it is somewhat visible. You will be able to tell these sleeves have been amended with extra fabric. And I think the reason I abandoned this project at the time is that I really didn't want to do that. Let's just say I've got over myself and I no longer care what people think about how my sleeves look. I'd much rather have a wearable garment than something lying in a bag for 6 years waiting for me to get over myself and just piece the goddamn sleeves. 18th century sleeves normally have a pleat in the top, but I wasn't sure how much extra room I was actually going to have. Additionally, the bodice was all put together weirdly, and for a variety of reasons I just decided to put the sleeves in by hand. I ended up going on an unexpectedly deep dive into Marie Antoinette's history, biographies written about her, and scholarly texts on the material. This is a subject which I think could take up an entire lifetime. Marie Antoinette has to be one of the people in French history that has been most written about, other than possibly Napoleon. I did, however, find one book that I found particularly interesting. It's called Marie Antoinette at Petit Trianon, Heritage, Interpretation and Visitor Perceptions by Denise Maillot-Baron. I will link to the Google Books extracts in the description below. This may not be the most accessible book to read, and I will admit I only read sections of it. It's a modern ethnography which has a very specific field of terminology. The subject of this book was not how Marie Antoinette actually was in history, but how Marie Antoinette was perceived at the time and how she is perceived today by visitors to the Palace of Versailles. In particular, they laid out the main cliches associated with the historical character of Marie Antoinette, one of which was the idea of her playing at being a shepherdess, which was connected to a perception that she was cut off from reality, substituted reality with her own version, and subsequently the idea that she rejected France and French people and wanted to replace it with either Austrian sensibilities or a version of reality more in touch with her Austrian heritage. I then decided, since this bodice was never ever going to pass as historically accurate, that I would just go the whole hog and put lacing loops into the front so that I could lace it close over my stays instead of just pinning it. I used metal eyelets and I worked over them with an embroidery thread. They are nice and pleasing looking and totally not historically accurate, but they do make it a little bit more versatile and that I don't have to rely on pinning myself into the thing. I then decided that it needed cuffs. Unfortunately, there was not enough material left to give it cuffs, so I used a different fabric. For reasons that I will go into a little bit later when you see the stomachers, I decided to do white cotton cuffs, but I covered them with a cotton organdy so that the texture would match the organdy I used in other parts of this outfit. And I've danced around a little bit. This is the first fitting. You can see just how low my pocket hoops are sitting. Well, that's not right. They should be on my waist. I have real trouble getting things to stay on my waist for a variety of reasons. I think a better and less soft, better fitting, just a better pair of stays would help with this, but also tying my pocket hoops on with a ribbon is not the best thing to do either. It's just all a bit of a mess, as you will see later when I get fed up with everything. This fitting served two purposes. One was to sort out the stomacher at the front, and I'd like you to take a moment to appreciate me wielding sewing scissors towards myself while wearing a garment that I've spent quite a bit of time working on. That moment of cavalierness aside, I'm just penciling in where I think that stomacher is supposed to go. The other thing I used that fitting for was where the pleats had to be. There's a lace-up back internally, but then a lot more fabric hanging loose over that. I pinned a piece of fabric to my stays, marked how wide that gap needed to be, and I'm using that as a guideline so I can pleat in the fashion fabric of the back into those lovely hanging pleats that everyone so adores about the 18th century. I sewed the pleats down real quick and then very carefully whip stitched a scrap of remaining fabric over the top to cover the raw edge. This, as far as I can tell, is pretty much the 18th century way of doing it. When I put the side pleats in, I'd kind of made a mess of it, so I put some reinforcement patches on the inside, and on the outside I darned where I'd nicked the fabric and made the gap too big. And now we're back to the cuffs. I seamed the two sides together. One edge of the fabrics was the self edge on both of them, so this is me just catch stitching that down. This is not remotely historically accurate. That stitch is way too recent, but it is very, very convenient. The other edge was raw, so that was a double turned hem and a quick whip stitch to secure that in place. Then the cuffs needed pleats for the inside of the elbow. This allows it to shape around your arm and generally creates the right silhouette. Once those were secured in place, I added a ruffled organdy trim to make them frilly and nice. So, remember my pocket hoops, the ones I was saying that didn't hang quite right and were sort of janky? It turns out they were in fact even worse than I remembered. They were just falling apart, bits were coming undone, the bones were too heavy and finished with duct tape. So halfway through the project I decided I couldn't stand them anymore and progressively ripped them apart. Here is some footage of me salvaging their corpses for anything that I can reuse. Waste not, want not. Do you remember that I also traced out a design for a stomacher? That's the front panel piece that goes into these jackets and gowns to cover up the front of the stays and finish off the outfit, and they're a lot of fun. I think we should bring stomachers back in a big way. I started off by trimming down the piece of fabric that I'd actually used as the blank and trimming it up between the two sides. I then traced that onto some very stiff polycotton twill, and because I had quite a lot of this just lying around and not being used for anything, I traced 2 more sections so that now I can have 2 stomachers instead of 1. I used the cotton piece and one of the polycotton twill sections to make the first stomacher, sewed some boning in. It's just zip ties, it's not clever, there's no rhyme or reason to what I'm doing here. I put a layer of cotton organdy from the portion where it's stained on top of this, and then arranged what scraps of yellow fabric I had left on top to cover as much of it as possible. I then decided I'd make some organdy strips to cover up the gaps between those, so here is some footage of me basically figuring out what I'm doing with this. I ended up with what I can only describe as the apple pie of stomachers. This is not historically accurate at all, and I'm not even sure I like it, but it was kind of satisfying. The 2 other layers of polycotton twill were sewn together all around the edges. Then I notched the seam allowance so I could turn it out cleanly. You'll notice that I'm just clipping into the curves where it's... Okay, no, I always get this wrong. You clip into the curves that are concave and you take notches out of the curves that are convex. Basically, when I turn this out, the seam allowance on the sides is going to spread out and the slits are going to open and have a gap between them, whereas around the bottom where it's curved, the seam allowance is going to fold inwards, and if I just did slashes, the notches would be overlapping each other, which is why you take chunks out so that doesn't happen. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. Again, I chucked some boning into that before sealing it up and cutting out a scrap of the remaining polyester taffeta to cover it. I then took what else I had left and tore it into strips, deciding that I was going to do some kind of ruffly trim. To start off with though, I just wanted to roughly attach the taffeta covering so that I had a nice smooth base to work from. So what has this got to do with Larp? The Larp community within the United Kingdom has a very high percentage of people who we would consider to be middle class. One of the main routes into Larp is through university societies, and it is in general an expensive hobby, which does present a financial barrier to entry. Becoming deeply immersed in the Larp scene is something that requires a huge output of time, energy, and money, things that you simply cannot do if you are struggling financially, attempting to juggle shift work, working multiple jobs, and any number of other situations. That isn't to say that everyone who LARPs is rich, but it is substantially easier to get into the hobby if you are more well off and come from a more privileged background. There are also, to my knowledge and in my experience, a great number of LARPs where you can choose to play someone who is impoverished, marginalized, or otherwise oppressed. That's not calling anyone in specific out, that is a general theme that comes up a lot. For the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus in on the idea of playing someone who is financially disadvantaged within the game world, as someone who is not financially disadvantaged in the real world. The sewist and YouTuber Annika Victoria has come up with, I think, the best phrase for describing this phenomenon. She originally used it for in fashion, but I think it works in LARP really, really well, which is putting on a poor person costume. My understanding from having played some of these LARPs is that by including financial insecurity as a theme, the intent of the game runners, and I believe the intent of most of the people playing it, is that this is an educational experience. What does it feel like to suffer financially? What does it feel like to be cut off from engaging with things or harassed for rent money when you just don't have it and you don't know when you're going to be able to get that? I think LARP has the capacity to be an amazing educational tool, and so obviously we should be thinking about these kind of things. But equally, it's a poor person costume. You put it on for a weekend and then you take it off. I had a bit of an experiment about what kind of ruffle pattern I wanted on the front of this, and I decided that a sort of stripy one would be best. I didn't want to use just the green taffeta though, so I tore some strips of cotton organdy and it was time to use all of the special sewing feats. First of all, I used my rolled hem foot to do rolled hems on the edge of all these long organdy strips. This is a thing you can do by hand, but I have things to do with my life, so there's a foot for that. Then it was time to get out this arcane contraption, which is the ruffle foot. The ruffle foot is actually more of a pleating foot, and it only works on fabrics that have a nice bite to them. I tried to do it on the taffeta, it did not work at all, but on the organdy it worked like a dream. So I did some strips ruffled just on one side to use as trim on the cuffs and eventually the collar, and on other strips I ruffled both sides in different directions to get the sort of flat strips that I would then use on the stomacher. The ruffle foot is both terrifying and hypnotic. It's also very important to remember to oil everything regularly. There's a lot of moving parts in this ruffle foot, and it was quite cheap for a ruffle foot, so I expect it will break on me sooner rather than later. I'd like to stop that from happening. Then it was just a case of arranging the trims that I'd made on the stomacher until they had a nice pattern that I liked. This involved making 1 million little tiny pleats. Let's bring this back to Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette had built for herself a little village in which she and her friends could spend some quiet time together. She also chose to make it a working farm, primarily as an educational institution. Honestly, the fact that she could marry these quaint ideals of rural simplicity with a genuine desire to improve, in her eyes, the future rulers of the country and give them an understanding of what French farmers might be going through, in my opinion, that was a laudable aim, but that is not how we've remembered her. The popular image, despite ongoing, clear historical evidence that is not correct, and voices of authority like the Palace of Versailles themselves stating that this is not correct, it is not true, it is not historically accurate to say that Marie Antoinette dressed up as a shepherdess and played at being a peasant, but that is how we have remembered her. As a society, we look back on that time and we perceive Marie Antoinette as the pretend shepherdess in the poor person costume. So while as LARPers we may speak to each other about the educational value of LARP, we may talk about how we understand that pretending to be financially disadvantaged for a weekend does not equate to the lived experiences of people who grew up in poverty. We also need to think about what people outside of our community see of us. Unfortunately, I don't have a great conclusion to draw on this one. LARP, and educational LARP in particular, is still an emerging genre. We're still figuring stuff out. And scholarly discourse around LARP is really in its infancy. That's not to say there isn't any, it's just all very, very new. But the next time you play a game or start writing a game and you think, wouldn't this be an interesting and valuable experience to include? Maybe think about how that gets perceived outside of our in-group and what we can do to change those perceptions outside of the LARP community. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. I will now send you back to sewing. And lo, it was finished. At some point I'll put a pretty backing on this, but no one's going to see that part, so just look at the lovely ruffles on the front. And now it's time for the final reveal. Not actually sure where the best place to put a lav mic on a petal there is. Things I never thought I'd have to find out. Do you like how I'm wearing a flower crown so you all know that this is fantasy, not an historically accurate costume? It won't work. Someone will still comment telling me about historical accuracy. Final thoughts. Honestly, my overwhelming sensation with this outfit is how unfinished it is. I need to put a tucker in this. I had leftover ruffled organdy trim, I didn't put it in. Quite like a fichu, which is like a shawl that goes around your shoulders. Something needs to be happening up here. Cap would be nice. Obviously I need hoops of some kind, which I should make. I just couldn't bear to use the old ones any longer. I am also finding I haven't laced this. I've just pinned it this time. And I'm finding that it restricts my mobility quite a lot, because if I raise my arms behind, like here, it pulls the pins out. In fact, it's kind of going already. I don't know if that is a fit problem or if it's the style problem. The impression I got is that the open front with the stomacher was quite a fancy look, and if you were doing more manual labour, you had a closed or crossover front. I could be wrong. That could be complete rubbish, and I've just picked it up from somewhere. Don't quote me on that to any of the channels who actually know what they're talking about. Ow. Ow. Something that comes up a lot when people are talking about their first 18th century project is they always want to go for half bone stays, either because full bone stays are intimidating or because they think they're going to be more comfortable, or they don't need the support. I went with half boned because, well, you've seen me. There's nothing to support. Don't make fully blown stays. Let's be honest, you want to make the big robe a la Francais court gown anyway. Most people don't want to make working women's attire. If you do, great, go with that. But it's so much easier to pin yourself into a gown when you don't have big gaps between the bones that are really easy to stick a pin in. My ribs are not happy right now. This is definitely not the end of my 18th century adventures this year, because honestly I'm just really perplexed as to how I've got this far. Things that are probably going to happen in the near future: new pockets, cap, some kind of fichu affair probably. Maybe some mitts. I like me some mitts. I'm going to hold off on the hat for now. The hat is a bit much. Having said that, who knows? I might just go mad and hand stitch a pair of fully boned stays. Well, regardless of your feelings on LARP in general, Marie Antoinette in specific, or indeed extremely budget versions of the 18th century. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to like, comment and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it. After all, it's nice not to howl into the void. I'm trying to get onto a more regular upload schedule and it's always a party, so press the button, do the things, make the YouTube gods happy. I have absolutely no problems with referring to a bunch of self-learning algorithms as gods. That's never going to cause any problems for anyone, ever. Down in the description box there will be all of the links and references that I referred to in this video, and also a link to my Ko-fi, which is a way that you can financially support me and this channel. I believe my current goal on there is a second camera battery. I have other camera batteries, but they're not great. I would really like an actual proper good camera battery so that when this one runs out, I can keep filming for more than 15 minutes. When people say buying generic batteries is just as good as buying the real ones, all generics are not created equal. So without any further ado, I am wearing quite a lot of polyester for a sunny day and now need to go take all this off. So thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Yeah, it's just not, this isn't, ow, ow. Ow. And also a link to my coat. Also a link to